The wind in the Montana Territory did not bother with pleasantries. It was an autumn wind in the year 1889, and it blew straight from the jagged teeth of the mountains, carrying the first sharp scent of snow. They said a wind like that would blow through a person's heart long before it found its way through their coat buttons. Mercy Quinn believed it. It felt as though the wind had been blowing through her for all of her 26 years. She held the reins of the tired, rented horse with a grip that was firmer than necessary. Her hands mapped with the fine. Silvery scars of 1,000 needle pricks and the occasional burn from a sputtering stove were not delicate. They were hands that knew work. In her other hand, she clutched a piece of newsprint, folded and refolded until its creases were as soft as flannel. It was an advertisement from the Dry Willow Gazette. A man named Callahan sought a woman to cook and provide letters for his child. The pay was modest, the location remote. It was perfect. Mercy needed a place to be, but more than that, she needed a reason to get up when the sun rose. After a life spent in orphanages and the spare rooms of families who took her in for labor. Not love. A reason was the most valuable currency she knew. The land stretched out around her in vast, undulating waves of yellow and gray. It was a beautiful and terrible place, a landscape that promised nothing but space and the freedom to starve in it if you were not strong enough. The sky was a high, lonely canvas streaked with the pale white of an early frost. Mercy had a particular kind of beauty herself, one that belonged to this landscape. It was not a beauty of soft edges, but of resilience. Her hair was the color of dry grass, tied back in a practical knot, and her eyes, a clear, steady gray, held no hint of surrender. She had been pushed down many times, but she had never learned how to stay there. The Callahan Ranch appeared first as just a smudge against the foothills, a collection of low buildings that seemed to be clinging to the earth for survival. As her horse plodded closer, the smudge resolved into a simple clapboard house, a sturdy-looking barn, and a web of corrals. It was small. The advertisement had not lied about that. A thin thread of smoke curled from the stone chimney, a signal of life in the immense quiet. Mercy felt a familiar tightening in her chest, a nervous knot of hope and fear that accompanied every new beginning. Hope that this time she might find a place to set down her few belongings for more than a season. Fear that she would be found wanting, that some flaw in her cooking or her character would be discovered, and she would be sent on her way once more. She was still 100 yards from the house when the flat, sharp crack of a rifle shot split the air. It was followed by another, and then a chaotic barrage of gunfire. A half-dozen scrawny cattle broke from a small herd near the barn, running in a panic. 2 men on horseback were chasing them, firing pistols not at the sky, but into the terrified animals. Before Mercy could fully process the danger, the front door of the house flew open. A tall man erupted from inside, a rifle already at his shoulder. He did not hesitate. He fired a single, deafening shot over the heads of the rustlers. The bullet whined through the air with deadly intent. The 2 men reined in their horses sharply. Startled by the sudden and expert resistance, they exchanged a look, then spurred their mounts and galloped away, disappearing into a fold of the hills. The entire violent episode was over in less than a minute. A small figure had followed the man out of the house, a little girl who could not have been more than 8 years old. She stood frozen on the porch, her eyes wide. A faded blue ribbon held back her sandy hair. As the rifleman lowered his weapon, Mercy saw the child and acted on pure instinct. She slid from her horse, her boots hitting the dusty ground with a soft thud. She moved quickly, her long skirt whispering against the dry brush. She reached the girl, took her small hand, and pulled her down behind the long, wooden watering trough near the porch. There was an old, heavy cast-iron pot lying on its side nearby, and without thinking, Mercy grabbed it and held it up, its thick bottom facing the direction the rustlers had fled. It was a foolish gesture, a flimsy shield against a bullet, but it was an action. It was a way of standing between a child and the world's ugliness. The man turned, his face a grim mask of anger and relief. He was Rhett Callahan. She knew it at once. He was as the landscape had made him, tall and lean and weathered. His jaw was tight, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon. When he was satisfied, the threat was gone. His gaze fell upon Mercy and his daughter, crouched behind the trough. He walked toward them, his boots slow and heavy in the dust. His expression was unreadable, a shuttered look that gave nothing away. The little girl peeked out from behind the iron pot. She looked at Mercy not with fear, but with an intense, unnerving curiosity. She asked if Mercy knew how to use a pot like a soldier. Mercy managed a small smile, the first to touch her lips that day. The tension in her shoulders eased just a fraction. She told the girl she knew how to make lunch faster than a gunshot. The girl, Sadie, seemed to consider this a very reasonable and impressive skill. She scrambled to her feet. Rhett Callahan stopped before them. He looked from Mercy to his daughter, then back to Mercy. His eyes took in her travel-stained dress, her calloused hands, the absurd pot still clutched in her grasp. He said nothing. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind and the nervous lowing of the scattered cattle. Mercy was not a woman who waited for men to find their words. She stood up, brushed the dust from her skirt, and met his gaze directly. She told him her name was Mercy Quinn, and she had come about the advertisement. Rhett Callahan's voice, when it finally came, was a low rumble, like stones moving at the bottom of a riverbed. He just said her name, Mercy Quinn. He nodded slowly, as if the name itself was something he had to weigh and measure. He took the rifle in one hand and gestured toward the house with the other. The interview, it seemed, would be held inside. The town of Dry Willow, a day's ride from the ranch, was a place built on three things: cattle, a rumor of silver in the hills, and gossip that spread faster than a prairie fire. It was a town where the law was a thin, easily snipped strand of barbed wire. The real power belonged to Silas Granger, a man who had grown rich hauling cattle to the railhead. As county commissioner, he had a fondness for the law when it served him, using paperwork and titles to squeeze the life from smaller operations that got in his way. When paper failed, he had men like the two rustlers, men who were not afraid to use guns, to enforce his interests. Mercy knew of men like Granger. Every town had one. They were the reason she kept her savings stitched into the hem of her petticoat and never owned more than she could carry. They were the reason a place like the Callahan Ranch, small and isolated, was both a haven and a target. As she followed Rhett into the simple, clean kitchen of the ranch house, she noticed a bucket of water by the door. It was only half full, and the water within it was murky with silt. She had seen the creek on her ride in, the Willow Creek that must feed this ranch. It was running low, dangerously low for this time of year, a sickly brown ribbon of water in a wide, stony bed. She had heard talk in the last town of a new dam Silas Granger had built upstream, a dam he claimed was for the public good, to create a reservoir for the growing town. But everyone knew the public good, in Granger's vocabulary, meant his own profit. If the water disappeared, the Callahan Ranch would wither and die. The scrawny cattle would perish, and Rhett Callahan would be forced to sell his land for pennies on the dollar to the very man who had choked it dry. Rhett motioned for her to sit at the plain wooden table. Sadie climbed onto a chair opposite her, her inquisitive eyes never leaving Mercy's face. Rhett remained standing, his rifle now resting against the wall. He was a man who seemed more comfortable on his feet, ready to move. He asked what she could do. Mercy did not list her skills like items in a general store. She spoke plainly. She could cook with whatever was on hand, from salt pork to prairie turnips. She could bake bread that would not break a tooth. She could mend clothes, make soap, and tend a garden. And she could teach a child her letters and her numbers, teach her how to read a book and write her own name. She had done all these things in more houses than she cared to remember. Rhett listened, his expression unchanging. He was a man who kept his thoughts locked away. He needed someone. That much was clear. His house was clean but bare, lacking the small touches that turned four walls into a home. He needed someone to watch over his daughter, to give her the schooling a remote ranch could not provide. He needed a housekeeper so he could be what he was, a rancher. He had to follow his cattle, to take them to higher pastures, sometimes for weeks at a time. He could not do that while worrying about his child being alone. His need was a palpable thing in the quiet room. Her own need was just as sharp. Mercy looked at the small, sturdy house. She looked at the curious child with the faded blue ribbon. She looked at the quiet, guarded man who stood before her. She was tired of running, tired of being the temporary help, the orphan girl who would be sent away when she was no longer useful. She wanted to earn her pay. Yes, she wanted to save enough money to one day buy a small piece of freedom, perhaps a little room in a town where no one knew her past. But looking at the quiet desperation in this small, struggling household, she felt the stirrings of something else, a desire to stay, a desire to push back against the harshness of the world, not just for herself, but for these two strangers. Their two separate, sharp-edged needs had collided in this dusty yard, under a sky threatening snow, and in that collision, there was the faint, fragile possibility of a home. Mercy's trial period was not marked on any calendar. It was measured in the rhythm of the wood stove, in the rising and setting of the sun. The kitchen, which had been a place of quiet function, transformed under her care. It became the heart of the ranch, a warm, fragrant core from which life seemed to radiate. The day began before dawn with the scrape of the grate and the crackle of kindling. Soon, the scent of coffee and frying bacon would fill the small house, a summons more effective than any bell. She established a schedule born of long practice. Mondays were for laundry, the big copper boiler steaming up the windows. Tuesdays were for baking, turning flour and cornmeal into loaves of bread, stacks of flapjacks, and pans of sweet cornbread that made Sadie's eyes shine. The rest of the week was a steady hum of cooking, mending, and cleaning. Each task performed with an efficient grace that seemed to push back against the vast, untamed wilderness outside the door. In the evenings, after the supper dishes were washed and stacked, the kitchen table became a schoolroom, with a piece of charcoal and a smoothed plank of wood. Mercy taught Sadie the shapes of letters, the magic of how they joined together to form words. The clatter of pots and pans gave way to the soft murmur of a child sounding out a syllable, a sound of fragile, determined progress. Yet, for Mercy, a deep and abiding unease remained. It was an old companion, this fear, one she had carried with her since her earliest memories of the orphanage. It returned with the wind, whenever a gale would sweep down from the mountains, making the windows rattle and the eaves moan. She would feel a cold knot tighten in her stomach. It was the sound of impermanence. The wind had a way of picking things up and setting them down somewhere else, scattered and broken. In her life, nothing had ever proven strong enough to resist that wind. No home, no family, no sense of belonging had ever lasted. She worked with a quiet intensity, driven by the hidden fear that one day the wind would blow through the Callahan Ranch and carry her away with it, just as it had from every other place she had tried to call home. She belonged nowhere, and the wind was a constant reminder. Rhett Callahan was a man of few words, but his eyes missed nothing. He moved around the edges of the new domestic world Mercy was creating, a silent observer. He noticed things. He saw the way Sadie's faded blue ribbon, once frayed at the edges, was now neatly hemmed with a few skillful stitches. He felt the new leather linings she had quietly sewn into his worn-out boots, a small comfort against the hard miles. He saw the tidy stacks of firewood by the stove, the clean, folded towels, the jar of wildflowers on the windowsill. She did these things without announcement, without seeking a word of praise. She simply saw a need and met it. He was not used to such quiet competence. His late wife had been full of laughter and song, filling the house with her presence. Mercy filled it with peace, with the steady, reassuring rhythm of a well-kept home. He found himself watching her hands as she kneaded dough or guided Sadie's small fingers around a piece of charcoal, and he felt a sense of wonder at their strength, their purpose. Life on the ranch settled into a routine punctuated by small moments of humor. Sadie, discovering a love for Mercy's molasses cookies, attempted to establish a new system of currency. She would learn the letter A for 2 cookies. Mercy, unamused, made a counteroffer. The letter A was for apple peeling. Each new letter learned would be rewarded with a new chore mastered. Sadie pouted, but the lessons continued. One evening, Rhett stood in the doorway, listening to their good-natured bickering. He watched Mercy patiently explain the difference between AB and AD for the 3rd time. A rare, small smile touched the corners of his mouth. He remarked that a proper teacher always kept a wooden ruler handy. Sadie's eyes went wide, but Mercy just looked at him, her own gaze steady, and said that a smart teacher knew that a fresh-baked pie worked better than a ruler any day of the week. On a trip into Dry Willow for supplies, the larger world intruded. The town was a dusty main street lined with false-fronted buildings. Horses stood hitched to rails, their heads drooping in the autumn sun. Men in denim and canvas coats watched from the doorways of the mercantile and the saloon. Mercy felt their eyes on her, the familiar assessment given to any stranger, any woman alone. She saw the Silver Spur Saloon, its bat-wing doors swinging open to reveal a haze of smoke and the low rumble of men's voices. It was where Silas Granger's hired hands spent their money, men like the 2 who had tried to run off Rhett's cattle. They were a rough-looking crew, and she gave the place a wide berth. As she was leaving the mercantile, a buggy pulled up, and Pastor Elias Boone climbed down. He was a kind-faced man with a gentle voice that had married and buried half the county. He tipped his hat to Mercy, his eyes full of a genuine warmth. He had heard that Rhett Callahan had hired some help. He hoped she was settling in well. God, he said, had a special love for those who built a home in the wilderness, for those who tended the hearth fires. His words were a small comfort, a blessing spoken into the dusty air. But as he spoke, Mercy saw a man emerge from the saloon. He was big and broad-shouldered, with a cruel set to his mouth. Burke Pike, Granger's foreman. He watched her, his eyes cold and flat. He leaned toward one of his companions and muttered something, though she could not hear the words. His meaning was clear in his contemptuous sneer. This was Granger's town. She was an outsider, an unknown quantity, and therefore a threat. Burke Pike's gaze followed her as she loaded her supplies, a silent promise of trouble to come. She overheard him say to his friend that she was just an orphan, with no family to stand for her, as easy to blow away as a tumbleweed. That evening, as Rhett was going over some papers at the kitchen table, Mercy saw the source of his troubles laid bare. It was not a proper deed, stamped and sealed by the territory government. It was an old, handwritten document, signed by his father and the fathers of his neighbors, attesting to their family's use of the water from Willow Creek for 2 generations. It was a gentleman's agreement, a matter of tradition, against a man like Silas Granger, who used the letter of the new laws as a club. Tradition was a shield made of smoke. Rhett's right to the water that was the lifeblood of his ranch was based on nothing more than honor, and honor was a currency Granger did not trade in. A few nights later, a storm rolled in. It was not the wind this time, but the thunder. The sky was bruised purple and black, and the first rumble was a low, distant growl. With each successive clap, it grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be shaking the very foundations of the small house. Sadie, who had been sleeping soundly, let out a small cry. Mercy went to her room. The little girl was sitting bolt upright in her bed, her small body trembling. Rhett appeared in the doorway behind her, his face etched with worry. He explained in a low voice that his wife had been caught in a summer thunderstorm 2 years ago. A falling branch. Sadie had been with her. The little girl had been terrified of thunder ever since. Mercy nodded, her heart aching for the child, for the man who had lost so much. She sat on the edge of the bed. She did not pull Sadie into a tight, suffocating embrace. She had learned in the orphanage that sometimes a frantic hug could feel more like a cage than a comfort. Instead, she simply put her arm around the girl's shaking shoulders. a firm, steady presence. She began to speak in a low, calm voice, telling a story about a brave little rabbit who thought the thunder was just the sky giants rolling pumpkins in a game. She did not try to silence the storm, but to make it smaller, less menacing. Sadie leaned into her, her sobs slowly quieting into shudders. Mercy held her, not too tightly, but not letting go, until the storm passed and the child's breathing evened out in sleep. Rhett remained in the doorway the entire time, watching them, a look of profound, weary gratitude on his face. The first frost had silvered the land, and the days grew shorter. One afternoon, Rhett took Mercy to a patch of ground behind the house, sheltered from the north wind by a stand of cottonwoods. He told her his wife had always wanted to plant a garden there. The soil was good, he said, his voice quiet. He just had not had the heart to break the ground himself. Mercy looked at the plot of earth, her practical mind already seeing neat rows of beans and squash. She saw the challenge. The creek was a good 50 yards away. Carrying water would be a back-breaking, endless task. She knelt and picked up a stick, sketching in the dirt. A small channel, she said, could be dug, but better yet, a trough made of wood, angled just so, could carry a steady trickle of water right to the edge of the garden. It would save hours of work. Rhett looked at her drawing in the dirt, then at her face, lit with the simple, elegant practicality of her idea. A slow nod was his only reply. They spent the next afternoon building it. They found old planks in the barn, and together they carried them to the creek. The work was hard. Their shoulders brushed as they lifted a heavy board into place. Their hands touched as he passed her a hammer. They did not speak much. They did not need to. There was a comfortable rhythm to their shared labor, a silent understanding that passed between them. They were building something together. It was more than just a trough to carry water. It was a small, fragile claim on the future. As the sun began to set that day, it painted the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red, the color of hot iron in a forge. The long, slanting light caught the dust that hung perpetually in the air, turning it into a golden haze that settled over the fences and the barn. The beauty of it was fierce, almost violent. It was a wild, untamable beauty, the kind that held a promise and a threat in the same breath. Mercy stood watching it, her hands sore from the hammer, her body tired from the work. She looked at the new wooden trough, a straight man-made line in the wild landscape. She looked at the small house, its windows glowing with the warm light of the lamp she had lit, and she felt something shift inside her, a feeling as beautiful and as dangerous as the sunset. It was the feeling of putting down roots in a place where the wind always blew, and the ground was hard, and nothing was ever promised to last. The days shortened, pulling the blanket of night over the plains earlier and earlier. The wind was a constant presence now, a restless spirit that prowled the fence lines and whispered secrets through the chinks in the cabin walls. After the supper dishes were cleared and Sadie was in bed, a deep quiet would settle over the ranch, a quiet so profound that the ticking of the mantel clock sounded like a drumbeat. It was on one such night that Mercy found she could not settle. She wrapped an old wool blanket around her shoulders and stepped out onto the porch, sitting on the top step. The sky was a vast expanse of cold, glittering stars, a sight so beautiful it made her feel achingly small and alone. The wind tugged at the edges of her blanket, a familiar, unsettling touch. It was the same wind that had pushed her from one place to the next her entire life, the wind that promised no attachments, no permanence. The door opened behind her, and Rhett stepped out. He did not speak, simply sat down on the step a respectful distance away, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. He held it out to her. She took it, her cold fingers wrapping around the welcome warmth. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the star-dusted prairie, listening to the lonely voice of the wind. The silence between them was no longer the empty space of strangers. It was a comfortable quiet, a shared territory. It was this comfort, this growing sense of safety, that finally gave her the courage to speak the words she had kept locked away for a lifetime. They were the truest, hardest words she knew. Her voice was barely a whisper, almost carried away by the wind. She told him that she was an orphan. She said she had no people, no kin to speak of, no real home, ever. She stared straight ahead into the darkness as she spoke, unable to look at him, bracing herself for the inevitable shift in the air, for the pity or the discomfort that always followed her confession. She had laid the barren landscape of her life at his feet, and she expected him to take a step back. Rhett was quiet for so long that she thought he might not have heard her. She felt a familiar cold dread begin to creep into her heart. Then he let out a soft sound. It was not a sound of pity. It was a low, quiet laugh, a sound of profound relief, as if a great weight had just been lifted from his own shoulders. He turned to look at her, and even in the dim starlight, she could see the gentleness in his eyes. He said that in that case, the ranch was home. Her, him, and his kid. The words struck Mercy with the force of a physical blow. They were the simplest of words, spoken without ceremony, yet they rearranged the entire world inside her. A fierce, unnameable emotion surged through her, a joy so sharp and intense it felt like pain. It was the feeling of a bone that has been broken for years finally being set, a searing agony that was also the beginning of healing. The word home, which had always been a locked door, had just been swung wide open. She was so overwhelmed she could not speak, could only nod. A single, jerky movement in the cold night air. The warmth from the coffee mug spread through her hands. A small anchor in a sea of overwhelming feeling. She was happy, and she was terrified. For the first time in her life, she had something she was desperately afraid to lose. As if summoned by the gravity of the moment, the cabin door creaked open a few inches. A small, nightgown-clad figure was silhouetted in the lamplight from within. Sadie's voice, a sleepy, solemn whisper, drifted out into the night. She said nobody asked her, but she agreed. The tension of the moment broke. A real, genuine laugh escaped Mercy, mingling with the tears that had begun to trace cold paths down her cheeks. Rhett chuckled, a deep, warm sound that seemed to push back against the darkness. He stood up and ruffled his daughter's hair, telling her to get back to bed before she caught a chill. The door closed softly, leaving them alone on the porch once more. They went inside soon after, back into the warm, steady glow of the kitchen lamp. The air in the small room felt different, charged with the weight of unspoken promises. While Mercy set her empty mug by the sink, Rhett walked over to the row of wooden pegs by the door. His wide-brimmed hat hung on one, a heavy canvas coat on another. He took her apron, the one she had left folded neatly on the back of a chair, and hung it on an empty peg right beside his hat. He did not say a word. He did not have to. The sight of her simple, flour-dusted apron hanging next to his weathered hat was a declaration more powerful than any speech. It was a quiet, unshakable statement of her place in this home. They belonged together on that wall. A distant coyote yipped, its lonely call a reminder of the vast, indifferent wilderness that surrounded their small circle of light. The dangers of the world were still out there, beyond the fences. Silas Granger and his ambitions, the failing creek, the coming winter. But, for the first time, Mercy felt she was on the inside of the door, not the outside. The steady, even glow of the lamp on the table seemed to pulse with the quiet rhythm of a heartbeat, the heartbeat of a home. The next morning, Rhett approached the matter with a cowboy's directness. He sat down at the kitchen table after breakfast, a piece of paper and a pen in front of him. He told her that his word was his bond, but that he wanted her to have more than that. He wanted something official, something the law would recognize. He proposed a contract. It was not the simple employment agreement she had expected. It outlined her wages, fair and steady. But it went further. It included a clause that gave her a share of the ranch's profits, if any were to be made. It made her a partner, not just a hired hand. It gave her a stake in the success or failure of this land. He pushed the paper toward her. Mercy looked at the carefully written words. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had never signed her name to anything more important than a receipt at a general store. To see her name, Mercy Quinn, written on a document that tied her to this place, to these people, was a profound and staggering thing. She picked up the pen, her hand surprisingly steady. Her signature was a little shaky, the ink a dark, permanent mark on the page. She was no longer just a drifter passing through. She had a name, and her name now stood for something. It stood for a share in the Callahan Ranch. Later that week, Burke Pike rode past the ranch at dusk. He was on his way back to town, his mind on the whiskey that awaited him at the Silver Spur. He slowed his horse as he drew near the Callahan place. He saw them. He saw Rhett sitting on the porch steps, mending a piece of tack. He saw the little girl, Sadie, chasing a grasshopper in the yard. And he saw the woman, Mercy Quinn, come out of the house with a basket of laundry, her movements easy and familiar, as if she had lived there her entire life. She said something to Rhett, who looked up and smiled. A real smile, one that reached his eyes. Burke watched the scene for a long moment, a sneer twisting his lips. He saw a widower, a child, and an orphan with no name to speak of. He did not see a family. He saw a weakness. He saw an unconventional arrangement that a man like his boss, Silas Granger, could easily twist into something ugly, something scandalous. He nudged his horse into a trot, his mind already composing the report he would deliver. This quiet, domestic scene was a piece of information, a weapon to be filed away and used when the time was right. A few days later, the outside world knocked. A rider from the county seat, a junior clerk with an air of self-importance, tacked a notice to the main gate of the ranch. Rhett found it when he returned from checking the northern fence line. He brought it into the kitchen, his face grim, and spread it out on the table under the lamplight. It was an official document, full of cold, legal phrases. It was a formal announcement from the County Water Commission due to a petition filed by Mr. Silas Granger concerning the equitable distribution of water resources for the development of the community. A preliminary survey of all properties along Willow Creek would be conducted. An inspector would be arriving within the month to measure flow rates and assess historical usage claims. The fragile home they had just forged in a quiet conversation under the stars was now facing its first official threat. The battle for the water, for the very life of the ranch, had begun. The piece of paper on the table was the first shot fired. The county inspector arrived in a sturdy buckboard pulled by a sturdy, unimaginative mare. The woman's name was Mabel Kincaid, and she was as solid and pragmatic as her transportation. She was not a villain. She was, perhaps worse, an instrument of the law, impartial and therefore immune to pleas for sympathy. She wore a plain, severe dress and carried a leather satchel filled not with malice, but with ledgers, measuring tapes, and sharp pencils. Her presence announced that the vague threat on the posted notice had now become a tangible reality, sitting right in their kitchen. She accepted a cup of coffee but did not drink it, letting it grow cold on the table as she explained her purpose in precise, clipped sentences. Her task was to measure the flow of Willow Creek above and below the Callahan property. She would assess the condition of the livestock and the land. She would take Rhett's testimony regarding his family's historical use of the water. All of it would be entered into her ledger and submitted in a report to the commission. Her face, a mask of professional neutrality, offered no hint of which way the scales of justice might tip. While Mabel Kincaid was measuring the slow, sad trickle of their creek, Silas Granger was busy poisoning the well of public opinion. His official petition regarding the dam was a masterpiece of civic-minded prose, full of phrases like community prosperity and future development. But it was the other document he filed, a private letter of moral concern to the county commission. That was his true weapon. In it, he painted a grim picture, a vulnerable, motherless child being raised in an isolated household of questionable character, a widower living with a woman of no known family, no documented past, a transient, An orphan. The word was a stone he threw, confident of the ripples it would create. And the ripples spread quickly. In a town like Dry Willow, a good piece of gossip could outlast a horse. The following Sunday, when Mercy rode to church with Sadie, she felt it. The change was subtle at first, a slight hesitation in the greetings from other women, eyes that would meet hers for a fraction of a second before glancing away. The polite smiles were a little too tight, the handshakes a little too brief. During Pastor Boone's sermon on the Good Samaritan, she could feel the weight of speculation from the pews behind her. She was the woman on the side of the road, and she could feel her neighbors crossing to the other side. The old, familiar coldness seeped into her bones. This was how it always began. The whispers, the judgment, the slow, corrosive acid of suspicion. They knew she was an orphan, and in the minds of so many, an orphan was a weed, a plant with no roots, liable to be troublesome and easily pulled up. Every polite nod that felt strained, every averted gaze, was a confirmation of her deepest fear when people knew the truth of her, that she came from nothing and belonged to no one. They would eventually cast her out. She sat straight and tall on the hard wooden pew, Sadie's small hand in hers, but inside, she was shrinking. Rhett was not a man to let a snake lie coiled under his porch. When he heard the whispers that had reached him even out on the range, a cold, quiet anger settled in him. He rode into Dry Willow the next day, not to the saloon or the mercantile, but straight to the office of the Granger Shipping Company, a new, imposing brick building that overshadowed everything else on the main street. He found Granger behind a large, polished desk, a picture of prosperous respectability. Rhett did not raise his voice. He stood before the desk, his hat in his hands, and his voice was low and steady. He said he had heard about Granger's concerns for his daughter's welfare. Granger leaned back in his chair, a smug, concerned expression on his face, and said that as a community leader, he felt it was his duty. Rhett's gaze was as unyielding as granite. He said the law was meant to protect people, to keep them safe in their homes, not to drive them out with lies and innuendo. The law was meant to hold communities together, not to be used as a tool to tear them apart for one man's profit. Granger's polite facade slipped. His eyes hardened. He said the law was also concerned with decency, with proper moral conduct, and that Rhett would soon find out that a piece of paper from the county could be more powerful than any rifle. The threat hung in the air between them. Rhett simply nodded, placed his hat back on his head, and walked out. The real threat was waiting in the alleyway beside the office. Burke Pike blocked his path. Stepping out from the shadows, he was bigger than Rhett, broader, and he smiled a predator's smile. He told Rhett he ought to listen to the boss, that it would be a shame for a man with a young daughter to find himself in some kind of accident, a fall from a horse. Maybe. Burke cleaned his fingernails with a long, wicked-looking knife as he spoke. Rhett's hands tightened into fists at his sides, but he knew a brawl in an alley was a fight he could not win, not in the long run. He met Burke's hard gaze and said nothing, walking around him and back to his horse, the foreman's mocking laughter following him down the street. The pressure on the ranch was no longer just legal or social. It was becoming physical. The diminished creek, now barely a stream, was not enough for the cattle. They grew thirsty, restless. One moonless night, their desperation boiled over. The lowing of distressed animals woke the house. Rhett rushed out to find that a half-dozen steers, maddened by thirst, had broken through a section of fence and were wandering, lost and vulnerable on the open plain. What followed was a night of brutal, exhausting labor. Rhett managed to round up the strays, his horse a dark shadow against the starlit land. But the immediate problem remained. The herd was parched. He and Mercy worked by lantern light, a desperate two-person bucket brigade. They hauled water from the house well, bucket after sloshing bucket, to fill the long troughs. The work was endless. Mercy's arms ached, her back screamed in protest, But she did not stop. Sadie, woken by the commotion, came out to help. Her small frame could only manage a small pail, but she trudged back and forth from the pump with a fierce determination, her small face set, to keep their spirits from flagging, to ward off the sheer, mind-numbing exhaustion. Mercy taught Sadie a little song she had learned long ago. It was a simple, silly tune about 4 pails and 3 hands, and how they could get the job done if they worked together. Sadie's small, clear voice cut through the night, a tiny beacon of defiance against the overwhelming task. Rhett, leading a thirsty cow to the trough, heard them and tried to join in on the chorus. He was a terrible singer, his deep voice hopelessly off-key. Sadie giggled, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that made the crushing labor feel, for a moment, a little lighter. They were a strange, mismatched choir in the dark, their song a testament to their shared will to survive. They were still at it when the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern sky. And it was then that Mabel Kincaid returned. She had come unannounced to take a dawn reading of the creek level. What she found instead was a scene of raw, frontier survival. She saw the exhausted man, the determined woman, and the small child, all working together, their faces smudged with dirt, their clothes damp with spilled water. She saw a family functioning under duress, a unit bound not by convention but by shared struggle. As she watched from her buckboard, a young calf, separated from its mother in the night's chaos, stumbled into a muddy patch near the creek bed and became stuck fast. It let out a piteous cry. Before Rhett could even react, Mercy was there. She waded into the thick, sucking mud without a moment's hesitation, her skirt forgotten. She soothed the terrified animal with a low, calm voice, putting her shoulder against its flank and pushing, her boots sinking deep into the mire. She struggled, her muscles straining, until finally, with a great heave, she freed the calf, which scrambled back to its mother. Mabel Kincaid watched the entire thing. She saw Mercy emerge from the mud, covered in filth but with a look of simple, unadorned triumph on her face. Mabel took out her ledger. On a clean page, beneath the cold, hard numbers of the creek's flow rate, she made a note in her neat, precise script. It did not mention deeds or statutes. It simply said the household provides genuine and diligent care for its livestock. It was a small, human observation in a column of facts. It was a seed of doubt planted against the official narrative of Silas Granger. The hope brought by that small victory was short-lived. The next morning, Rhett went out to check the wooden trough they had built, the one that was meant to water their future garden. He found it in pieces, hacked apart by an axe. The precious water it had held now just a dark, useless stain on the ground. The wood was splintered, the destruction savage and complete, and there, in the soft earth beside the wreckage, was a single, clear boot print. It was large, with a distinctive worn patch on the heel. Rhett had seen that boot print before, in the dust of the alleyway behind Granger's office. He stood there for a long time, the pieces of their hard work at his feet. The fight had changed. It was no longer about paperwork and public opinion. Granger had sent his dog off the leash. This was now about survival. Rhett looked back toward the small, sturdy house where Mercy was starting breakfast and Sadie was just waking up. He knew then that this fight would not be won with words alone. That evening, Mercy stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the darkening plains. She saw the ruined trough. She felt the chill of the town's judgment. She heard the echo of Burke Pike's threat in Rhett's grim silence. The old instinct, the one that had kept her safe for 26 years, screamed at her to run. Pack your bag, take your savings, disappear before the real trouble starts. It was the Orphan's creed, travel light and never give them a stationary target. But then she saw Rhett walk out of the barn, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that went bone deep. She saw the lamp glow in Sadie's window. She felt the solid floor of the kitchen beneath her feet. This was not just another house, another temporary stop. It was the first place the word home had ever meant anything more than a roof. Leaving now would not be self-preservation. It would be a kind of death. It would be giving up on the only thing she had ever truly wanted. She took a deep breath, her decision settling over her with a quiet, solemn finality. A voice inside her, a voice she had never heard before, spoke with unshakable clarity. "I am staying this time," it said. "I am staying, no matter what the cost to my heart." The warning did not come from the sky, but from the earth. A stillness fell over the plains, a heavy, breathless pause that silenced the birds and made the cattle grow restless. The air, once crisp with the promise of winter, became thick and tasted of grit. On the western horizon, the clear blue sky began to curdle, turning a sickly yellow-gray. It was not a cloud bank, but a rising wall, a solid curtain of dust being pushed forward by a wind that had not yet reached them. Rhett came in from the barn, his face grim. He had seen this before. He told Mercy to bring in the laundry and fill every bucket and pot with water from the well. He did not need to explain why. She moved with a quick, practiced efficiency, her heart beginning a low, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. Sadie, sensing the urgency, helped her, her small face pale with apprehension. The wall of darkness advanced with an unnatural speed, swallowing the sunlight, swallowing the horizon. The temperature dropped. The wind arrived not as a gust, but as a solid, physical blow that made the house groan. And then the world disappeared. It was not like nightfall. It was a thick, suffocating blackness, a tempest of soil and sand that blotted out the sun and turned midday into midnight. The sound was a deafening, continuous roar, the sound of a giant grinding mountains into dust. Fine, stinging particles found their way through every crack, under the door, through the window frames. The air became a choking fog of dirt. Through the maelstrom, they could hear the panicked bawling of the cattle and the terrible shriek of metal as a piece of the barn roof was torn loose and sent cartwheeling into the darkness. Rhett acted with the calm of a man who knew his enemy. He grabbed 2 dish towels, soaked them with their precious water, and handed one to Mercy, tying the other around his own nose and mouth. He pushed a wide-eyed Sadie toward the trap door in the pantry that led to the small root cellar. He told her to stay there, no matter what she heard. But as he made to secure the main door, he saw the corner of the heavy canvas tarp that covered the wood pile begin to lift, threatening to tear away and expose their winter fuel supply to the full fury of the storm. Without that wood, they would not survive the cold to come. He shouted to Mercy over the roar, pointing. They had to save it. Together, they fought their way into the blinding, scouring wind. It was like wading through a solid element, a river of grit that tore at their skin and filled their eyes. They reached the woodpile, the tarp now snapping and cracking like a ship's sail in a hurricane. They each grabbed a corner, their bodies thrown off balance by the force of the wind. Rhett had a length of rope and began to lash the tarp down to the sturdy corner posts of the smokehouse. It was in that moment of violent chaos that the world exploded for Mercy. There was a sound like a pistol shot close to her ear, the sound of a plank of wood splintering under immense pressure. A piece of the damaged barn, a 2-foot length of siding, had become an airborne spear. It slammed into her left shoulder with a sickening, brutal impact. A cry was torn from her throat, but the wind swallowed it whole. A blinding, white-hot pain shot through her, from her shoulder down to her fingertips. Her arm went numb, useless. She stumbled, her grip on the tarp failing. The force of the impact had knocked her shoulder from its socket. The pain was a wave of pure, debilitating agony that threatened to pull her under, to make her collapse right there in the maelstrom. But she did not fall. The same stubborn grit that had carried her through a lifetime of hardship rose up in her. She would not be broken by a piece of wood. She would not be broken by this storm. Gritting her teeth against a wave of nausea, she tucked her useless arm against her body. With her good hand, she fumbled for the scarf tied around her neck, pulling it free. working with a clumsy, one-handed desperation. She looped the scarf around her neck and elbow, fashioning a crude sling to immobilize the injured arm. Her face was a pale, sweat-streaked mask of pain, but her eyes were clear with a furious resolve. She grabbed the flapping corner of the tarp again with her good hand, planting her feet, and held on. She held on as Rhett finished tying the last knot. Her whole world narrowed to the burning fire in her shoulder and the desperate need to not let go. When the last rope was secure, Rhett grabbed her, half carrying her through the blinding dust back to the house. He guided her into the pantry and down the steep, narrow steps into the root cellar. He pulled the heavy trapdoor shut, and the roar of the storm was instantly muffled. Reduced to a deep, subterranean rumble, the cellar was small and dark, the air thick with the earthy smell of potatoes and the fine, choking dust that had followed them down. A single lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. Rhett gently helped her to sit on an old crate in the flickering lantern light. He could see the unnatural angle of her shoulder, the stark white of her knuckles where she clutched her injured arm. His hands, usually so steady with rope and rein, trembled as he reached for her. He told her in a low, rough voice that it had to be put back. Now. She looked into his eyes, saw the fear and the resolve mirrored there, and gave a single, sharp nod. The world shrank to the small, dusty space of the cellar, to the feeling of his strong, hesitant hands on her arm. He gripped her wrist and her upper arm, his touch surprisingly gentle for all his strength. He told her to breathe. The pain was a living thing, a fire that consumed her as he began to pull. Steady and firm. She cried out, a sharp, strangled sound, her head falling back against the damp stone wall. There was a sickening, grinding pop as the bone slid back into place. The fire in her shoulder was replaced by a deep, throbbing ache, but the sharp, incapacitating agony was gone. She slumped forward, gasping, her body trembling with the aftershock of pain and relief. Rhett did not let go. His hand remained on her shoulder, a warm, grounding weight. His other hand came up to brush the dust-matted hair from her face, his thumb stroking her cheek for a moment that stretched longer than was strictly necessary. In the close, dusty air, she could feel the warmth of his breath, could see the deep, raw concern in his eyes. It was a moment of profound, unspoken intimacy, forged in shared crisis and intense vulnerability. Sadie, who had been huddled in a corner, crept forward. She looked at Rhett's worried face and said, with the simple, unwavering faith of a child, that he was stronger than the wind. Rhett let out a ragged, hoarse laugh that sounded more like a sob. He told her the wind just had a big mouth. The small, absurd exchange broke the spell, easing the terrible tension in the small cellar. When they finally emerged hours later, the wind had died, leaving an eerie, profound silence. The world was changed, remade in a monochrome of red dust. A thick, fine layer of silt covered everything. The house, the barn, the fences, giving the landscape the look of an old, faded photograph. The damage was immediately apparent. A whole corner of the barn roof was gone, leaving the loft exposed to the sky. One of the corrals had been flattened, and a calf. One of the late-season births was missing, likely lost in the blinding confusion of the storm. The ranch had survived, but it was wounded, bleeding from a dozen small cuts. They were still surveying the damage, a sense of overwhelming weariness settling over them. When a lone rider approached, it was Burke Pike. He sat on his horse, taking in the scene of devastation with a look of undisguised satisfaction. He did not offer condolences or help. He brought a message from Silas Granger. In light of the recent unfortunate events, and knowing the hardship Rhett must be facing, Granger was prepared to make a generous offer to buy the ranch. The price he named was an insult, a vulture's bid for a dying animal. Rhett's face was a stony mask. He told Burke to tell Granger that the Callahan Ranch was not for sale. Not today, not ever. Burke just shrugged. his smirk widening. He said the offer stood. For now. As he turned his horse to leave, Mercy, who had been standing silently on the porch, stepped back into the house. She emerged a moment later with a cup of coffee, the cold dregs from that morning's pot. She walked to the edge of the porch, and with a calm, deliberate movement, she flung the contents of the cup, the cold, black liquid splattered across the heel of Burke's expensive, polished boot. He reined his horse in sharply, his face contorting in a snarl of fury. Mercy looked at him, her eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. She told him that cold coffee was not for strangers. Before Burke could react, Rhett had stepped between them, his hand resting almost casually on the axe handle that was leaning against the porch rail. Burke looked from Rhett's calm, dangerous stillness to Mercy's defiant face, and then he spurred his horse and rode away, a stream of curses trailing behind him in the dusty air. The next day brought an unexpected sight. A wagon was making its way up the lane, followed by 2 riders. It was Pastor Boone, and with him were 2 of Rhett's neighbors from the next valley over, men who were also struggling under the thumb of Granger's water politics. They brought with them lumber, hammers, and a quiet, unshakable sense of purpose. They did not say much. They did not need to. They simply set to work, their hammers echoing in the still air, a rhythm of defiance and community. This was the other side of the frontier, the unwritten law that said you helped your neighbor rebuild because you knew your turn could be next. It was in the middle of this flurry of activity that Mabel Kincaid's buckboard appeared once more. She had come to follow up on the reports of the dust storm. She took in the scene, the damaged barn, the men working together, the tired but determined set of Rhett's jaw, the woman with her arm in a clean white sling directing the storage of the new lumber. She saw resilience. She saw a community refusing to be broken. She walked over to the wreckage of the barn, made a few notes in her ledger, and then, before she left, she told Rhett that a report to the commission would now include a new assessment, an assessment of his household's ability to withstand natural disaster. It was not a promise of victory, but it was a glimmer of hope. A small point scored in their favor on the cold, impartial pages of the law. That night, after the neighbors had gone and a temporary patch covered the barn roof, Mercy stood before the small, cracked mirror in her room. She eased her arm out of the sling, wincing at the deep, ugly bruise that blossomed across her shoulder and chest, a violent tapestry of purple and black. In the past, a wound like this would have been a mark of misfortune, another reason to move on, to escape the place where the pain had happened. But as she looked at the bruise in the dim lamplight, she felt something different. This pain was not the mark of a victim. It was the ache of an anchor holding fast in a storm. It was the price of standing her ground, of protecting something. For the first time, a pain felt less like a reason to leave, and more like a testament to why she had to stay. It was the pain of belonging. The county courthouse was a world away from the dust and wind of the ranch. It was a place of polished wood, high ceilings, and the solemn weight of the law, a weight that felt designed to press down on men like Rhett Callahan. They sat on a hard bench, Rhett, Mercy, and Sadie between them. Rhett was wearing his Sunday coat, looking stiff and uncomfortable. Mercy wore her plainest, neatest dress, her hands folded in her lap, her injured shoulder aching with a dull, persistent throb. Sadie, sensing the gravity of the occasion, was unusually quiet, her eyes taking in the imposing room. Silas Granger sat at a table near the front with his lawyer, a man whose suit was as slick and expensive as the oil he applied to his hair. Granger nodded to acquaintances in the room, a confident, magnanimous smile on his face, the picture of a concerned citizen. When the hearing began, his lawyer spoke first. He unrolled large, impressive maps showing the proposed dam and reservoir. He spoke in a smooth, flowing voice about progress, about the future of Dry Willow, about the necessity of taming the wildness of the land for the greater good of the community. He made Rhett's reliance on a century-old creek seem like a stubborn refusal to join the modern world. When it was Rhett's turn, he did not approach the commission with maps or eloquent speeches. He walked to the front of the room and placed his father's old ledger on the table. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. In a low, steady voice, he explained that this book contained the history of his family's life on that land, a history written in the language of rainfall, planting seasons, and the steady, uninterrupted flow of Willow Creek. A few of his neighbors, men with faces as weathered as his own, stood up one by one to say that it was true. The Callahans had always been there, and the water had always been theirs to use. Their testimony was simple, honest, and in the polished, formal courtroom. It sounded hopelessly old-fashioned. Then Granger's lawyer stood up for his rebuttal. He did not look at Rhett. He turned his gaze, cold and dismissive, directly on Mercy. He began by expressing his deepest sympathies for Mr. Callahan, a man clearly struggling to manage his affairs and raise a child alone. A man, he suggested, whose judgment might have become clouded by circumstance. A man who, in his desperation, had brought a woman of no standing into his home. He let the words hang in the air, a woman of no standing. He then spoke directly to the commission, his voice dripping with false concern. He asked them to consider the environment in which the Callahan child was being raised. He mentioned a woman with no family to vouch for her character, no history that could be verified. He said the word as if it were a disease, a stain that could never be washed clean. An orphan. A low murmur went through the crowded room. Mercy felt the sound like a physical blow. It was the collective weight of every suspicious glance, every whispered question she had ever endured. She saw the women from the church, their faces now masks of pious judgment. She felt Sadie press closer to her side, and the shame was a hot, bitter flood in her throat. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, to run from this room and never stop. But then she felt Rhett shift beside her, his anger a palpable heat. She saw the rigid set of his jaw, the way his hands clenched into fists. He was about to rise, to speak in a fury that would only damage his case. And in that moment, something inside Mercy broke. It was not her spirit. It was the old, brittle shell of fear she had carried for a lifetime. She was not just a nameless orphan anymore. She was a part of this family, this ranch. An attack on her was an attack on them. She placed a calming hand on Rhett's arm, and then she stood up. She did not wait to be asked. She did not look at the lawyer or the commission. She looked out at the faces in the room, the curious, the hostile, the indifferent. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the silent room. She said that it was true. She was an orphan. She told them she grew up in a place where your name was stitched on your clothes so you would not get lost, and where you learned early that you owned nothing that could not be taken away. She told them she had worked in houses all over the territory, houses where she was a servant, a pair of hands, but never a person. Then her voice grew stronger, steadier. She said that at the Callahan Ranch, she also worked. She cooked the meals that put strength in a man's arms and a child's bones. She mended the clothes that kept out the cold. She washed the floors and tended the hearth. In the evenings, she taught a little girl how to read, how to unlock the world that was held inside of books. She paused, and her gaze finally settled on the lawyer, clear and unwavering. She told him that she did not have a deed to the land or a long family history in a book, but she kept that house running. She kept it running with her hands and with her heart. A profound silence filled the room. No one moved. No one whispered. Mercy had not pleaded for their pity. She had simply stated her value, a value that had nothing to do with her origins and everything to do with her presence. It was Mabel Kincaid who broke the silence. She cleared her throat and addressed the commission. She said that while Mr. Granger's plans for development were certainly worthy of consideration, the law also made provisions for historical precedent. She spoke of the importance of preserving the small, family-run operations that were the backbone of the territory. She suggested that a compromise might be in order, one that recognized Rhett Callahan's historical water rights while still allowing for the future needs of the community. She proposed that the commission table the decision on the dam and, in the interim, issue an order maintaining the natural flow of Willow Creek until a more thorough and independent engineering study could be completed. The commission, swayed by the unexpected turn of events, agreed. It was a temporary victory, a reprieve, but it was a victory nonetheless. Silas Granger's face was a study in controlled rage. He had lost this round, and he did not take losing well. As they filed out of the courthouse into the bright, cold sunlight, Sadie tugged on Mercy's sleeve. She whispered that Mercy had sounded just like Pastor Boone, only she was missing a big hat. Mercy looked down at the serious little face, and a genuine smile, the first she had felt all day, touched her lips. She whispered back that they had a hat. They could borrow her father's. Their relief was short-lived. As they reached the boardwalk, Burke Pike stepped out of an alley, blocking their path. His eyes were fixed on Mercy, and they were filled with a cold, ugly light. He told her she was a clever talker, for an orphan, but talk would not help her when she found herself alone in the dark. Before he could say more, Rhett was there, moving between them with a speed that was startling. He did not say a word. He simply stood there, his body radiating a quiet, lethal menace. His hand was clenched at his side, and for a tense, heart-stopping moment, Mercy thought he would hit him. The air crackled with the promise of violence. Then a calm, authoritative voice cut through the tension. It was Mabel Kincaid. She told Burke that the county hearing was concluded. Any further attempts to intimidate a witness would be noted in her official report. Burke shot her a look of pure venom, but he held his tongue. He gave Rhett a final, hateful glare, and then he turned and walked away. The ride back to the ranch was long and quiet. The weight of the day seemed to press down on them, the victory feeling fragile and temporary. As they neared their own land, the familiar shape of the house and barn rising to meet them, Rhett finally broke the silence. He turned to Mercy, his face looking worn and tired. He tried to thank her, but the words came out clumsy and halting. He was not a man who was comfortable with expressing gratitude. Mercy simply shook her head. She looked at him, her gaze direct and steady. She told him that he guarded the fences and kept the dangers of the world at bay. She kept the kitchen, the heart of the house, warm. That was their partnership, and it was enough to let a child sleep soundly through the night. Rhett looked at her, a deep, unspoken understanding passing between them. He nodded, and they rode the rest of the way in a comfortable, shared silence. That evening, a fragile peace settled over the ranch. After supper, as Mercy was washing the dishes, Sadie came to stand beside her. She was holding her faded blue ribbon, the one she always wore in her hair. She held it out to Mercy. She said it was for her, so she could tie her hair back when she cooked. Forever. Mercy dried her hands and took the ribbon. The small piece of worn, faded fabric felt impossibly heavy in her hand. It was more than just a ribbon. It was a transfer of trust, an acceptance, a gift from a child who had so little to give. Her throat grew tight with an emotion she could not name. She looked at Sadie, at her hopeful, trusting face, and then she looked over at Rhett, who was watching them from the doorway, his own eyes shining with a strange, soft light. She tied the ribbon in her hair, the faded blue a stark contrast to her practical, workaday dress. It was a flash of color, a badge of honor. Their peace was shattered the following afternoon by the arrival of another rider from the county. He carried not a notice this time, but a sealed, official summons. Rhett took it, his face paling as he read the document. His hands began to shake with a rage that was terrifying in its stillness. It was a new legal filing from Silas Granger, thwarted in his attempt to take their water. He had launched a more personal, more vicious attack. The document was a petition to the court to have Rhett's legal guardianship of Sadie revoked. It cited his unmarried cohabitation with a woman of unknown character as evidence of a morally questionable and unstable home environment. It claimed he was an unfit father. Granger was no longer trying to take their land. He was trying to take their child. He was trying to tear their family apart. The stakes had been raised to a level they had never imagined. This was no longer a fight for survival. It was a fight for their very souls. The legal summons lay on the mantelpiece, a stark white rectangle of paper that seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. It was a constant, silent reminder of the new war Silas Granger was waging. A war aimed not at their land, but at their hearts. The threat of losing Sadie cast a long, cold shadow over the ranch. A shadow that the brightest hearth fire could not seem to dispel. But the law is a slow, grinding machine. Nature was not. Winter did not arrive that year. It attacked. It descended overnight. A sudden savage onslaught of snow and ice that bypassed the gentle melancholy of autumn entirely. One day the plains were a tapestry of gold and brown. The next they were a stark, unforgiving expanse of white, buried under a foot of snow that fell as thick and silent as powdered lime. The wind that came with it was a new kind of beast, not the restless spirit of autumn, but a hungry predator that howled around the corners of the house and clawed at the windows with icy fingers. The abrupt, brutal cold caught them all off guard. It also seemed to find the one small weakness in their defenses. Sadie, her spirit still heavy with the worry of the lost calf from the dust storm, had spent the previous afternoon searching the creek bed for any sign of it, her boots sinking into the half-frozen mud. That night, she developed a cough, a small, dry sound that echoed in the quiet house. By morning, the cough had deepened, and her skin was hot to the touch. The fever had taken hold. Mercy worked with a quiet, focused desperation. She bathed Sadie's forehead with cool cloths, brewed teas from the herbs she had gathered, and tried to coax spoonfuls of broth between the child's dry, cracked lips. But the fever was a stubborn, rising tide. Sadie drifted in and out of a restless, fretful sleep, her breathing growing shallow and rapid. By the second night, she was delirious, muttering about lost calves and gardens buried in snow. Rhett, his face a mask of taut, helpless fear, found the small brown bottle of fever medicine in the back of the pantry. It was nearly empty. There was only a single dose left, a dark, viscous liquid that was not nearly enough to break a fever this high. The town doctor was their only hope, but the snow had fallen for 2 days without stopping. The drifts were already chest-high in places, and the trail to Dry Willow would be impassable, even if they could get through. Word had reached them via a neighbor that the doctor himself was trapped on the north side of the river, where he had been tending to a difficult birth when the storm hit. They were cut off, isolated, with a dwindling supply of medicine and a child whose life was flickering like a candle in a gale. There was only one other option, a desperate, dangerous long shot. A ranger station, a lonely outpost of the law, was situated 20 miles to the west, a straight, treacherous line across the open plains and through the winding, ice-choked canyons of the foothills. They would have medical supplies. They had to. Rhett made his decision in the cold, pre-dawn light of the third day. He stood in the kitchen, pulling on his heaviest coat and wrapping a long wool scarf around his neck. Mercy, her face pale with exhaustion, watched him. She told him she was coming with him. 2 riders would have a better chance than one. He turned to her, his eyes dark with a pain and resolve she had never seen before. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his grip firm. He told her no. Her place was here. He needed her here. He said that she had to keep the fire going, to keep Sadie warm. He would ride the wind. Their roles were set. She was the anchor. He was the one who had to venture into the storm. The journey was an act of war against a brutal, indifferent enemy. The world outside the cabin was a formless, howling vortex of white. The snow was so thick he could not see more than a few feet in front of his horse's head. The wind drove the flakes into his face like 1,000 tiny needles, and the cold was a physical weight, a presence that sought to crush the warmth from his body. It found its way through his coat, his gloves, his boots, sinking into his bones with a deep, relentless ache. He gave his horse its head, trusting the animal's instincts to keep them on the invisible trail. Hours passed in a timeless, featureless blur of white. The greatest danger was not the snow, but the ice that lay hidden beneath it. He was navigating a narrow pass, a shortcut through the hills. When it happened, the horse's back legs suddenly slid out from under it on a sheet of black ice. The animal screamed, a terrifying, high-pitched sound of pure panic, as it scrambled for purchase, its hooves striking sparks from the rock. They were on the edge of a steep, winding canyon. Rhett felt the world tilt, felt the sickening lurch as his horse's hindquarters slipped over the edge, dangling over a sheer drop into a white, swirling abyss. He reacted on pure instinct, throwing his weight to the high side, kicking his boots free of the stirrups and launching himself from the saddle. He landed hard in a deep snowdrift. The breath knocked from his lungs. The horse, relieved of his weight, managed to find a desperate, clawing foothold and pull itself back onto the trail, its body trembling, its sides heaving. Rhett lay in the snow, his heart hammering against his ribs, staring at the empty space where he'd almost fallen to his death. He knew then how close he was to failing. He pulled a signal flare from his saddlebag, a last resort, and fired it into the gray, churning sky. It shot upward, a brief, desperate streak of red against the endless white, a prayer that someone might see. Back in the cabin, Mercy waged her own, quieter battle. The fire was her domain, a living, breathing creature that she fed and tended with a religious devotion. She sat by Sadie's bedside, the small world of the sick room her entire universe. She bathed the child's face, changed the sweat-soaked linens, and spoke in a low, continuous murmur, her voice a thread of hope in the fever-dreamed darkness. She did not speak of the storm or of the fear that was a cold, hard knot in her own stomach. She spoke of spring. She painted a picture with her words, a vision of the garden they would plant behind the house. She described the feel of the warm earth, the smell of the damp soil. She told Sadie about the rows of green beans that would climb up tall poles, and the round, orange pumpkins that would sleep in the sun. She described the swing that Rhett would hang from the thickest branch of the cottonwood tree, a swing that would fly so high Sadie could almost touch the clouds. She spun this fantasy of warmth and life, a fragile, vibrant tapestry of words, and she willed it to be stronger than the fever, stronger than the raging storm outside. It was a ranger on a routine patrol who saw the flare. He found Rhett 2 hours later, half frozen, but still moving forward. He led him the last few miles to the station, a small, sturdy cabin that was a beacon of warmth and safety in the wilderness. They gave him hot coffee and food and listened to his desperate story. The station had a medical kit, a precious commodity. They gave it to him. But it was not a gift. Everything in this land had a price. Rhett had no money with him. Instead, he unbuckled the hand-tooled leather belt from his waist, the one his father had made for him, the one he had worn every day for 15 years. He laid it on the table. The head ranger, a man who understood the currency of survival, looked at the belt, then at the desperation in Rhett's eyes, and nodded. The trade was made. The ride back was a blur of exhaustion and numb determination. The storm was beginning to break, but the cold was still a lethal enemy. Rhett clutched the precious medical kit to his chest. His mind focused on a single point of light in the swirling darkness, the lamp in his kitchen window. He rode until he could no longer feel his hands or his feet, until his body was a dead weight in the saddle. He made it to the ranch, but his strength gave out at the very end. He slid from his horse and staggered toward the house, his legs refusing to obey him. He fell on the porch steps, the medical kit spilling from his numb fingers onto the snow-dusted wood. He could go no further. Mercy heard the horse and threw open the door. She found him there, curled against the cold wood, his face ashen, his lips a dark, frightening blue. She did not panic. A lifetime of emergencies had taught her to be calm in a crisis, with a strength she did not know she possessed. She dragged him inside, away from the killing cold. She pulled off his frozen boots and coat, wrapped him in every blanket she could find, and propped him up in a chair before the roaring fire. Her hands were shaking, but her movements were sure and steady. She forced a spoonful of whiskey and hot water between his clenched teeth, the fiery liquid a shock to his frozen system. He lay there for a long time, his body trembling violently as the warmth slowly, painfully, began to seep back into him. Mercy worked over him, rubbing his hands and feet, her heart a frantic, terrified bird in her chest. Finally, his eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy, unfocused. He looked at her, his gaze struggling to make sense of her face, which was bent close to his. His breath was a warm, whiskey-scented cloud in the cold air. He whispered her name, and then he said something that made her heart stop. He said he came back because he heard the kitchen calling. Then his eyes closed, and he fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. Mercy stood there, her hands still resting on his blanket-wrapped shoulder, the echo of his words filling the quiet room. He had not said he came back for her, or for Sadie. He had come back for the kitchen, for the hearth, for the center of the home she had created. It was the most honest, profound declaration of love she could imagine. She took the medical kit and administered the medicine to Sadie. Then she sat in a chair between the sleeping man and the feverish child, a lonely, vigilant guardian. She watched, and she waited, and she prayed. Sometime in the deep, silent hours before dawn, Sadie's fever broke. The heat receded from her skin. Her breathing deepened and evened out, and she fell into a true, healing sleep. The storm passed. The next night, the sky was clear and cold, and the world outside was silent, wrapped in a deep blanket of snow. The three of them were huddled together in the warm kitchen, bathed in the soft glow of the lamplight. Sadie was weak but lucid, sitting wrapped in a quilt on Rhett's lap. Rhett was still tired, his movements slow, but the life had returned to his eyes. The wind that moaned softly around the eaves no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like a lullaby. As Mercy added another log to the fire, her hand brushed against Rhett's where it rested on the arm of his chair. He turned his hand over and gently caught her fingers in his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her. He looked at her, his gaze full of a new, quiet intensity. He said that some things, some very important things, needed to be given a name so that nobody could ever take them away. The day of the guardianship hearing dawned cold and unnervingly bright, the sun glaring off the endless fields of snow. The world felt brittle, as if it could shatter. Inside the same solemn courtroom, the air was thick with a different kind of chill. This was not about water or land rights. It was about character, about morality, and the whispers that followed them into the room were sharper, more personal than before. Silas Granger's strategy was as cruel as it was effective. He had not just brought a lawyer. He had brought a man who called himself a minister, a traveling preacher with a booming voice and eyes that were too small and too close together. This man, whose vest was stained with what looked suspiciously like breakfast gravy, took the stand and spoke of the sanctity of the family. He painted a lurid picture of a household in moral disarray, of a widower's grief leading him into a sinful arrangement that was surely poisoning the soul of his innocent child. He used words like transient and temptation, and he looked directly at Mercy as he spoke, his voice dripping with condemnation. The prejudice in the room was a palpable thing, a rising tide of judgment that threatened to drown them. Mabel Kincaid sat listening to this performance, her face a study in professional impassivity. When it was her turn to speak, she did not offer opinions or sermons. She presented facts. She produced a signed and sworn affidavit from the families in the next valley, the ones whose children Mercy had begun teaching to read in the evenings. She unrolled a petition, its pages filled with the signatures of neighbors who attested to the good order, the kindness, and the stability of the Callahan household. She spoke in her dry, official tone, but her words were a powerful counter-narrative. She was not defending their morality. She was documenting their contribution to the community. She was holding up a shield of simple, verifiable truth against a storm of insinuation. During the midday recess, the tension spilled over from the courtroom into the hallway. Mercy had gone to a window for a breath of fresh air, trying to quiet the frantic beating of her own heart. She felt a presence behind her and turned to find Burke Pike standing there, his bulk blocking the light. His smile was a foul thing. He leaned in close, his voice a low, menacing rumble, and said that once they were done with Rhett, maybe he would take in the little orphan himself. The insult was so vile, so unexpected, that Mercy recoiled, stumbling backward. In that moment of imbalance, he shoved her. It was not a hard push, but it was deliberate, contemptuous. It sent her staggering against the wall. A collective gasp went through the crowded hallway. Sadie, who had been standing nearby, let out a piercing scream. Rhett was across the hall in an instant, his face a thundercloud of pure, murderous rage. His fists were clenched, his body coiled to spring. For a terrible second, Mercy thought he would kill Burke right there, but then he stopped. He drew a deep, ragged breath, and the violence receded from his face, replaced by an iron control that was somehow more frightening. He looked past Burke, his gaze locking with someone over the foreman's shoulder. He spoke, his voice dangerously quiet. He said there was the law, and then there were witnesses. Burke turned, a sneer on his face, and found himself looking directly into the calm, sorrowful eyes of Pastor Elias Boone, who had seen the entire exchange. The sneer on Burke's face faltered. He had assaulted a woman in front of the town's most respected moral authority. The attack, meant to intimidate, had backfired spectacularly. When the hearing reconvened, there was a new tension in the air. The judge looked at Granger and his lawyer with a new, colder scrutiny. But the final, decisive blow came from a direction no one could have anticipated. A woman had entered the back of the courtroom during the recess. She was older, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and a face that was plain, unsmiling, and etched with the lines of a hard life. She asked the judge if she might be permitted to speak on the matter of Mercy Quinn's character. She introduced herself as Nettie Alvarez. She was the matron of the St. Jude's Foundling Home, the orphanage where Mercy had spent the first 16 years of her life. A silence fell over the room. This was the source, the very origin of the shadow that had followed Mercy her whole life. Nettie Alvarez walked to the front of the room, her back as straight as a fence post. She did not speak with sentiment. Her voice was as practical and unadorned as her dress. She told the court that she had known hundreds of children. She said most of them, when they left her care, just kept moving. They were tumbleweeds, blown by the wind, afraid to put down roots because they had never been shown how, but she said Mercy was different. She looked directly at Mercy, and for the first time, a flicker of something soft and sad touched her stern features. She said that this girl, this one here, she always tried to stay, in every home, in every position. She had worked harder than anyone, trying to earn a place, trying to make herself indispensable. Nettie turned her gaze to the judge. She said that if Mercy Quinn had finally found a place where she felt she could stay, then the court ought to move heaven and earth to make sure she was not driven away from it. Her testimony was devastating. It took the very word Granger had used as a weapon, orphan, and reforged it into a testament of character, of loyalty, of a desperate, lifelong search for a home. Nettie Alvarez had not just vouched for Mercy's past, she had validated her present. The judge's decision was swift. He dismissed Granger's petition, his voice sharp with disapproval. He stated that he found no evidence of an unstable or immoral environment, but rather a family that was clearly bonded by affection and mutual support. He issued a stern warning to Silas Granger against bringing such frivolous and malicious actions before his court again, and he cautioned him that any further reports of witness intimidation would be met with the severest penalties. The ride home was a blur. The weight that had been pressing on them for weeks had been lifted, and the relief was so profound it left them feeling lightheaded, almost giddy. The snow had begun to melt under the afternoon sun, and the world seemed new, washed clean. As they reached their own land, Rhett did not ride directly to the house. He reined his horse in beside the newly repaired water trough, the one they had built together. The dark, wet wood gleamed in the sunlight, and a small, steady trickle of snowmelt ran through it, a promise of the life to come. He dismounted and came around to help Mercy down. He took her hands in his grip warm and sure. He looked at her, his face serious, his eyes full of a raw, open emotion that made her breath catch in her throat. He did not lead with pretty words. He was a rancher, a man of the earth, and his words were as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet. He told her he needed a name for what they were, a name as strong and as permanent as a fence post, a name that the law and men like Granger could never tear down. Then he did something that shattered her completely. Rhett Callahan, the quiet, proud, self-sufficient man, knelt. He knelt right there in the mud and melting snow, his gaze never leaving hers. He asked her, his voice rough with feeling, if she would be his wife. The world seemed to stop. The only sound was the gentle gurgle of water in the trough and the frantic beating of her own heart. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his image. She looked down at him, this good, strong man, kneeling in the mud, and a laugh, watery but real, escaped her. She told him he had certainly chosen a romantic spot for a proposal, a spot that smelled distinctly of cattle. A slow, wonderful smile spread across his face. He said he chose it so they would always remember it, so they would remember what they had built together and what they were fighting for. She did not need a grand, eloquent speech. Her answer was as simple and as true as his question. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Just a nod, but it was enough. It was everything. As if on cue, a triumphant shout came from the direction of the house. Sadie, who had ridden ahead, was standing on the porch, pumping her small fist in the air. She yelled that she had said yes first, weeks ago. Rhett stood up, pulling Mercy into his arms. The embrace was not one of passion, but of homecoming. It was a feeling of rightness, of two broken pieces finally clicking into place. He had no ring, but that did not matter. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a long, thin strip of leather lacing. With deft, practiced fingers, he braided it into a small, simple loop and slid it onto her finger. It was a rancher's ring, made of the stuff of his life, a promise of shared work and shared days. In response, Mercy reached up and untied the faded blue ribbon from her hair, the ribbon Sadie had given her. She took Rhett's large, calloused wrist and gently tied the ribbon around it. The soft, worn fabric was a fragile, powerful bond, a symbol of the child who had brought them together, the child who had made them a family. They stood there for a long moment, bound together by leather and ribbon, by promises made in the mud and the sunlight. They knew the fight was not over. As they walked toward the house, Rhett's arm around her, he looked out at the vast, challenging landscape. Granger would not give up. The battle for the water was still to come. Rhett looked at Mercy, a new, fierce determination in his eyes. He said they would build their defenses. They would build them with people, with their neighbors. They would build them with paper, with the law on their side. And if they had to, he said with a small smile, they would build them with every drop of rain the sky would give them. With the breaking of the long winter, a new and tentative life returned to the plains. The snow receded, leaving the earth dark, damp, and smelling of renewal. The trickle of water in Willow Creek, fed by the melting drifts in the high country, grew into a steady, confident flow, a sound that was like music to Mercy's ears. It was a season of hope, a hope made tangible by the arrival of a buggy carrying not one, but two official-looking figures. Mabel Kincaid had returned, but this time she was accompanied by a man with a tripod, a level, and a set of rolled-up charts. He was an independent engineer, hired by the territory at Mabel's insistence, a man whose only loyalty was to the unarguable truths of physics and hydrology. For 2 days, the men worked. They measured the gradient of the land, charted the historical path of the creek, and took extensive readings at Granger's Dam. Rhett watched them from a distance, his face unreadable, his hands never still as he mended tack or repaired a fence post. He had placed his faith in the law, and now he could do nothing but wait for its gears to turn. While the machinery of justice moved with its slow, deliberate pace, the bitter resentment of Silas Granger festered. Thwarted in the courtroom and publicly shamed, he was a man cornered, and that made him more dangerous than ever. His rage found its outlet in his bluntest instrument, Burke Pike. The attack came not with a gunshot, but with the stealth of a thief in the night. It was a moonless evening, the air still carrying a chill. A quiet gathering was taking place in the Callahan's kitchen. Pastor Boone had ridden out for supper, and he and Rhett were discussing plans for a new schoolhouse, while Mercy showed Sadie how to properly knead a batch of dough for the next day's bread. It was a scene of such simple, domestic peace that the sudden sharp crack of a twig snapping outside the window sounded as loud as a rifle shot. Rhett was on his feet in an instant, his hand instinctively going to the mantel where his shotgun rested. But Pastor Boone, his face calm, held up a hand. He suggested that a direct confrontation might be exactly what their enemy wanted. He motioned for them to douse the main lamp. In the sudden darkness, lit only by the soft glow of the fire, Boone and Mercy crept to the window. They saw him, a large, dark shape moving stealthily along the newly rebuilt water trough. It was Burke Pike. In one hand, he carried a length of fuse, and in the other, a heavy, canvas-wrapped bundle. It was dynamite. His intention was brutally clear. He was going to destroy the trough, their symbol of hope. The very artery that would feed their future garden. He was going to blow it to pieces. An act of pure, spiteful vandalism. Mercy's heart hammered against her ribs. But beside her, Pastor Boone was a pillar of calm. He whispered to her to stay put. He slipped out the back door as silently as a shadow. Mercy watched, her breath held tight in her chest, as Burke knelt by the trough, fumbling with his deadly package. Just as he struck a match, its flare a tiny, demonic spark in the darkness, Pastor Boone's voice, calm and clear, cut through the night. He called Burke's name. He said the Lord was a witness to all acts done in the dark. Startled, Burke lurched to his feet. Spinning around, the lit match fell from his fingers. In his panic, he stumbled backward, his heavy boot catching on the edge of the very trough he had meant to destroy. He went down hard, his body twisting awkwardly. A sickening, sharp crack echoed in the night air, followed by a howl of pure agony. He lay on the ground, clutching his arm, the dynamite forgotten beside him. Pastor Boone walked calmly over, picked up the dangerous bundle, and then stood looking down at the writhing, cursing man. When Rhett arrived with the shotgun, the fight was already over. Burke Pike, the bully of Dry Willow, had been defeated by a wooden plank and his own violent haste. The next morning, the sheriff came and took him away, his arm in a crude splint, his face a mask of pain and humiliation. The final verdict on the water rights arrived a week later, not with a summons or a public hearing, but in a sealed envelope delivered by Mabel Kincaid herself. She sat at their kitchen table, a rare, almost imperceptible softness in her eyes. As Rhett broke the seal, he read the document aloud, his voice low and steady, but with an underlying tremor of profound emotion. The commission's findings were clear. The independent engineer's report had confirmed that Granger's Dam was an illegal impediment to a historically established waterway. The Callahan family's traditional rights were officially and legally recognized. Silas Granger was to be fined for the unauthorized construction and ordered to redesign the dam's sluice gates to ensure a guaranteed minimum flow to the lower ranches at all times, with priority given to them during the dry season. They had won. It was a quiet victory, a triumph of paper and persistence over power and greed. There was no cheering, only a long, deep, shuddering sigh of relief that seemed to come from the very soul of the ranch itself. Their wedding was as simple and as solid as the land they stood on. They were married on a bright spring afternoon, under the whispering leaves of the cottonwood trees by the creek. Pastor Boone officiated, his words not about holy matrimony, but about the sacredness of building a home and a family in a hard land. Sadie stood between them, holding both their hands, her face beaming. The leather ring Rhett had made was gone. In its place was a plain silver band, hammered into a perfect circle by the town blacksmith, a man who had signed their petition and refused to take a penny for the work. Rhett's vow was not a flowery promise of eternal love. He looked into Mercy's eyes, his own gaze clear and true, and he promised her that every morning she woke up, this place and the people in it would need her. It was the most beautiful promise she had ever heard. That night, after the neighbors who had come to celebrate had ridden home and Sadie was fast asleep, a profound quiet settled over the house. The fire in the hearth cast a warm, dancing glow on the rough-hewn wooden walls. Rhett took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and led her to the small chair by the fire. They sat there for a long time, not speaking, simply being. The house was no longer just a structure of wood and stone. It was an extension of themselves, a silent witness to their long, hard journey. The night was not about passion, it was about peace. It was the profound, bone-deep comfort of knowing you were finally, completely, and irrevocably home. It was the feeling of belonging, a feeling so solid and real she could feel it in the steady beat of his heart through the palm of his hand resting against hers. Spring unfolded in a glorious, vibrant rush. The garden, watered by the steady flow from the trough, thrived. The first tender green shoots of beans began to spiral up the poles Rhett had set for them. And one sunny afternoon, the sound of Sadie's joyous, unfettered laughter filled the air as she soared back and forth on the new swing Rhett had hung from the sturdiest branch of the big cottonwood. The gentle, rhythmic gurgle of the water in the trough was a constant, soothing presence, the lifeblood of their ranch, a song of survival. Their home became a quiet center for the community. Neighbors who had once looked at them with suspicion now came asking for Rhett's advice on Mercy's ingenious water trough design. Pastor Boone, true to his word, started an evening school for the scattered ranch children who were too far from town to attend regular classes. The lessons were held in their kitchen, around the big wooden table. Mercy taught, her patient voice explaining the mysteries of arithmetic and spelling, while Rhett sat in the corner, quietly mending harnesses and building new, smaller benches for the growing number of students. One afternoon, Mabel Kincaid's buckboard pulled up to the house. She had not come on official business. She said she had been in the area and was thirsty. Mercy, without a word, poured her a cup of coffee and set a thick slice of warm, fresh from the oven cornbread on a plate beside it. Mabel ate in her usual practical, no-nonsense way, but as she was leaving, she paused on the porch and looked out at the greening fields, at the sturdy, repaired barn. She turned to Mercy, a small, rare smile touching her lips. She said that her work had taught her that the law was a necessary and powerful tool. But she had also come to believe that for the law to be truly just, it needed a heart, too. Silas Granger was not ruined, but he was diminished. The fines were substantial, and the public humiliation of having his project curtailed and his methods exposed cost him dearly in both influence and respect. He lost his seat as county commissioner in the next election. A few months later, the sign on his shipping office was taken down, and it was said he had moved his operations further west, to a newer territory where his name was not so tarnished. The villain had not been slain, but he had been bound by the ropes of the very law he had sought to twist for his own purposes. He still existed, a shadow somewhere out on the vast plains, but his power over their lives was broken. One morning, Rhett was outside by the main gate. He had taken down the old, weathered sign that had simply read Callahan. With a bucket of white paint and a steady hand, he was carefully lettering a new one. When he was finished, he stepped back to admire his work. Mercy came out, bringing him a dipper of cool water. She stood beside him, and they looked at the sign together. The fresh paint gleamed in the morning sun. It now read, Callahan Quinn Ranch. The two names were joined by a small, simple hyphen, a mark that was not a division, but a bridge. It was a quiet, unadorned statement of fact, a declaration to the world that this was their place, together. It was not a long speech or a fancy title, it was just a name, the name of their family. The High Plains summer settled over the ranch, a season of profound and quiet change. The sound that now defined their days was not the wind, but the water. It was the steady, reassuring gurgle in the new, deep channel they had dug from the creek. It was the lifeblood of the ranch, pulsing through the wooden trough to the thirsty rows of their garden, a sound of promise fulfilled. The world was still a hard and demanding place. The sun beat down, and the land was vast and indifferent. But the great, crushing conflicts that had threatened to tear their small world apart had finally been laid to rest. The battles had been won, not with a single dramatic victory, but with a slow, steady accumulation of small, stubborn acts. The war with nature, the dust and the snow, had been met. It was met by Rhett's desperate ride through the blizzard, by Mercy's unwavering hand on the flapping tarp, and by the hammers of neighbors who understood that community was the only true shelter in the wilderness. The barn stood strong, its new roof bright against the sky, and the garden, once a patch of dry earth and a broken trough, was now a vibrant, defiant square of green. The war with society, with the poison of prejudice and the power of a rich man's whispers, had also been won. The courtroom, once a place of fear and judgment, had become a place of truth. Mercy's simple, honest words, followed by the unexpected, granite-steady testimony of Nettie Alvarez, had broken the back of Granger's lies. They had learned that justice was not just a matter of cold, hard statutes. It required the law. Yes, but it also required good people to stand up and lend it their hearts. Mabel Kincaid, with her ledger and her integrity, had proven to be as vital as Pastor Boone, with his faith and his courage. The villains themselves were no longer a threat. Burke Pike, his arm badly healed, was serving a long sentence for attempted destruction of property and his long list of other crimes. And Silas Granger, his reputation in tatters, his public influence broken by the legal rebukes, had finally sold his interests in Dry Willow. He was gone, a bitter shadow that had moved west, seeking new, uninformed communities to exploit. The law, which he had tried to use as a weapon, had become his cage. The most profound change, however, was within the three people who called this ranch home. Their own internal wars were over. Sadie, who had lived in the shadow of a terrifying memory, was the ranch's truest measure of peace. When a summer thunderstorm would rumble in the distance, she no longer hid. She would look to Mercy, who would smile and remind her it was just the sky giants rolling pumpkins, and Sadie would smile back and return to her play. She was the proudest student in the new evening school, eagerly showing the neighboring children the letters she had already mastered, her fear replaced by a bright, confident belief in tomorrow. Rhett, who had been a man walled in by his own grief, had finally stepped out into the sun, naming his love for Mercy. Giving her his name and a share of his land had been an act of reclaiming his own life. He was no longer just a widower grimly holding onto the past. He was a husband, a father, a man actively building a future. The silence that surrounded him now was not one of loss, but of contentment. He spoke less than most men, still, but every word he said was a foundation stone. And Mercy, who had spent her entire life as a wanderer, a lost soul bracing for the next gust of wind to send her on her way, was finally still. She was the keeper of the fire, the undisputed heart of the home. She no longer woke with the cold knot of dread in her stomach. The wind could howl all it pleased. It was just the wind, and it could not touch her. Her hands, mapped with the scars of her trade, were now also marked by the soil of her own garden, the flower of her own kitchen. The faded blue ribbon Sadie had given her was tied in her hair every morning, a simple, faded banner of her arrival. It was a symbol of the profound, quiet shift that had occurred. The ribbon passing from the child to the woman who had become her mother. Their life was not, and would never be, easy. They knew this, that autumn. They worked together to stock the root cellar. They were not driven by the panic of survival, but by the steady, purposeful rhythm of provision. They knew the snows would return. They knew the creek might run low in a drought. They knew the tax assessor would visit, his demands as regular and as certain as the seasons. But the loneliness was gone. The fear of facing the world alone was gone. Whatever the land or the law threw at them, they would face it together. One afternoon, the mail rider brought a letter. Mercy saw the return address, St. Jude's Foundling Home, and her heart gave a strange, painful lurch, a pull from a past she had thought was finally sealed away. She opened it, her hands not quite steady. The words were Nettie Alvarez's, as practical and unadorned as the woman herself. The orphanage was full, as it always was. But there was a boy. She wrote, a quiet 10-year-old named Thomas. He was good with his hands, but he was often overlooked. He had heard the story of the woman from St. Jude's who had spoken in a courtroom, the woman who had found a home. He had asked Nettie, his voice barely a whisper, if she thought the house on the prairie still had any room. Mercy read the last line, and the old, cold ache of the orphanage filled her chest, the memory of that vast, lonely hope, the hope of being chosen. She looked up from the page. She looked around her kitchen, at the shelves heavy with preserved food, at the hooks by the door, at the empty wooden chair at the head of the table. She looked at Rhett. He was standing in the doorway, watching her, his face calm. He had read the contents of the letter in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask the question that was filling her heart to bursting, but he did not let her. He just nodded, a slow, sure movement. He said their house had plenty of bowls, but they were short on people to eat from them. That night, a deep and final peace seemed to settle over the high plains. The air was warm, and the sky was a profound, velvet black, scattered with a brilliance of stars that looked close enough to touch. Rhett sat on the top porch step, the familiar, comforting smell of leather and polish rising as he mended a bridle. Mercy and Sadie sat on the swing, their bare feet brushing the porch boards, the ropes creaking in a gentle, rhythmic lullaby. The only other sound was the one that had become their favorite, the soft, constant murmur of the water, running through the trough, watering the garden, whispering of life. Mercy was whispering to Sadie, their heads bent close together in the soft, intimate darkness. She was talking about the bean harvest, about the fat, dry pods they had collected. She explained how they had to choose the best ones, the strongest ones, to save for seed, because inside those small, hard beans was the promise of the entire next summer. Rhett finished his work. He coiled the leather lace and stood up, his tall frame a solid shadow against the starlight. He went to the row of pegs by the door. His hat hung there, beside Mercy's apron. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded object. It was a new ribbon, this one the color of a bright, cheerful spring buttercup, with a quiet, deliberate motion. He hung the new ribbon on the empty peg, a small, bright flag of welcome, a silent, hopeful forecast of a family that was still growing, still choosing to build. They were not born a family. They chose to be one. Every hard, bright day of it. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.